The worldwide elite, the ruling class, not even the people who are actually in power, but them, their families, and all their hangers on, they have a very low opinion of us, the 99%. And their low opinion is expressed in a particular way um, that comes from their superiority, their alleged superiority. It's basically they don't think that the 99% that you, I, all the normal people out there, they don't think we have agency. They think that we are a lower order of life, and I would suggest that they're wrong. But since we notice this bad trait in them, we probably don't want to fall into that ourselves, right? Anyhow, I'm going to try to give you a good example of how the elite think. We're going to look at an interview that was done in the early 2000s, I believe. The man being interviewed is dead now. His name is Boris Berezovsky, and this is relevant because of the poisoning that occurred in Britain here the other day. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First off, we're going to talk a little bit about Russian history. Because in this clip that I'm going to show you, Berezovsky makes some claims about the Russian character, and we're going to see if he's right. But first off, we're going to do a little bit of the history. So in 1580 to 1615, around in that time, Russia was in total social upheaval. They had a really bad famine. Their central government was extremely weak. There wasn't one person or one power structure with control of the country. So, of course, there were going to be highwaymen, brigands, local potentates popping up all over the place, just a disintegration of social power because there wasn't really a state that could control the place. So, after that, you get the Romanov dynasty, who appeared, I think, in the 1620, about like that. And then they had the task of consolidating a new Russian state out of this shambles that had occurred during what they called the Time of Troubles. And it wasn't easy. There was a lot of fighting. A lot of people were killed by the Central Russian state. A lot of people were subjugated. So this is state formation. It's not pretty. It seems like afterwards it's probably a good thing, but because it creates peace and the opportunity for prosperity, a central culture. You can have art again, high art, and all that kind of good stuff. You can have learning, but in order to create the space for all that to happen, you have to subjugate people. You got to take their money away. You got to take their property away. You basically have to make them subjects, right? You got to take away their freedom. So it's a give and take. We all want to live in a state because we like the things that it provides, but we really chafe at the loss of our freedom. So the first event that I want to discuss is a rebellion that happened in the 1660s. So this is about 40 years into the formation of the Russian state. There was a group of monks in a monastery, the Solovetsky Monastery, which was really more like a castle almost. I mean, this thing was massive and extremely well defended. And the monks in this monastery said, you know what, we don't like the religious direction that this new Russian state is going in, and we're not going to take part, and we're going to resist with force. So they did, and this rebellion lasted for almost 10 years. The central government tried to attack this monastery several times and failed. They were going to starve them out, but the people would never starve to death because they were extremely well prepared and resourceful. So finally, they assaulted the monastery and killed everybody inside. The siege was successful. So that was a conservative group who did not like the new direction, the new stuff that the Russian state was proposing, and they fought for 10 years and died for it. In 1773, Catherine the Great had her husband killed. She was an imported German woman who was being married off to the Romanov prince or heir apparent, So she was married off to him, and then when he became the Tsar, she had him killed. She became the Empress. There was immediately a rebellion, and the constituent parts of this rebellion were peasants all across Russia, but mostly in the southern and eastern part, Cossacks, who were the dominant military ethnic group in the Ukraine at the time, and also the Old Believers. So that's the religious group that did not want to adopt any of the new religious stuff that was being promoted out of Moscow, out of the capital, Petersburg. So that rebellion went on for, I think, 2 or 3 years. It was extremely violent. A lot of people got killed, and then eventually the rebellion was put down. The leaders were executed. After the Bolshevik Revolution, after the Bolshevik coup, in 1920, there was a peasant rising in the Ufa governorate because the Soviets were confiscating people's food. In 1920, there was a peasant rising in Tambov against more Soviet food confiscations, and that rising left 100,000 people dead. In 1921, there was a peasant rising in the Altai Krai against more Soviet food confiscations. And finally, to top it off, in 1921, the Soviet government's own sailors in Kronstadt revolted against the government, and the government had to shoot them until they stopped rioting. And then they executed, most of the rioters they could find afterwards. So if you look at the history of Russia, you find a lot of rebellions. You find a lot of peasants who were involved in rebellions. You find the Old Believers, who are the most conservative form of Russian Orthodoxy, involved in every one of these. You find that the Old Believers were often killed by the state and still refused to give up their beliefs. So that's the version of Russian history that I'm familiar with. And now I'm going to play you this clip from Berezovsky.
И таким образом можно сформулировать по существу некоторую гипотезу. Наиболее эффективны те общественные и политические, так скажем, системы, в которых существует максимальная возможность для самореализации каждого из ее членов этой общественной системы, каждого гражданина. Но при том, что каждый гражданин добровольно принимает на себя некоторую систему ограничений. И вот, собственно, переход от тоталитарных систем к либеральным и означает достижение критической массы людей, согласных принять добровольно некоторую систему, некоторую конкретную систему самоограничений.
Может быть, переход от внешних ограничений к внутренним.
Абсолютно точно. Да, поскольку совершенно верно.
Ограничения-то были всегда.
Абсолютно верно, но эти ограничения навязывались. Да?
Far away from London, in another office of Berezovsky, a secret video recording was made. In 1998...
И просто я хочу сказать, какой ценой человечеству достается знание, и как тяжело приподняться над общепринятыми форматами, стандартами и прочее.
Русским людям труднее или какие-то общечеловеческие вещи?
Вы знаете, я бы не так. Вот знаете, я бы не так.
Я немножко
я понимаю, о чем, почему. Знаете, вот менталитет российский глубоко рабский. И поэтому с таким удовольствием воспринимается как раз система внешних ограничений.
Русским людям труднее или какие-то общечеловеческие вещи?
Вы знаете, я бы не так. Вот знаете, я бы не так.
Я немножко
я понимаю, о чем, почему. Знаете, вот менталитет российский глубоко рабский. И поэтому с таким удовольствием воспринимается как раз система внешних ограничений. Если вот народ взять на себя ответственность, я считаю, что готов, когда вот этот диктат государства был снят, и вдруг за 10 лет у нас появились миллионы предпринимателей, миллионы независимых политиков. То есть журналистика стала совершенно другой. Да? То есть оказалось, что Россия полностью подготовлена вот к этому принципиальному шагу в развитии своем. Эта готовность есть, но нужно было двигаться дальше, чтобы закрепить вот эту свободу, да, вот эту независимость, которая разрушает. Ведь моя главная претензия к сегодняшней власти – это разрушение менталитета свободного человека. Вот в этом это ключевая точка. Да. Не то, что там, все эти глупости с вертикалью власти, с контролем над средствами массовой информации, они имеют прямые, абсолютно отрицательные последствия. Разрушение нарождающегося свободного менталитета граждан России.
Okay, let's hit the high note on that 2 more times just to make sure we all got what's important here.
Русским людям труднее или какие-то общечеловеческие вещи?
Вы знаете, я бы не так. Вот знаете, вот я бы не так.
Я немножко
я понимаю, о чем вы говорите. Знаете, вот менталитет российский глубоко рабский. И поэтому с таким удовольствием воспринимается как раз система внешних ограничений.
Русским людям труднее или какие-то общечеловеческие вещи?
Вы знаете, я бы не так. Вот знаете, вот я бы не так.
Я немножко
я понимаю, о чем вы говорите. Знаете, вот менталитет российский глубоко рабский. И поэтому с таким удовольствием воспринимается как раз система внешних ограничений.
So what we're looking at here is a man who made his billions of dollars during the privatization period in Russia. What that basically entailed was in the transition from a state-owned economy to a private economy, there has to be a way, there has to be a mechanism by which things end up in private hands. What seems to have happened in almost every case was that a Jewish man was able to capture billions of dollars worth of previously state and therefore public property. It ended up in the hands of these almost exclusively Jewish men. Berezovsky, I'm talking about the Jewish background because Berezovsky himself often stressed his Jewish identity, so I think that it's relevant. And if 9 out of 10 of these guys are from an ethnic background that's maybe only 2% of the population of Russia, perhaps it might be relevant. And it's relevant to the supremacy inherent in his claims. If you look at Russian history, like I talked about earlier in the video, the Russian people do not have a slave mentality. They have a conservative, traditionalist mentality, and if they think that it's necessary to fight to maintain their way of life, they will do so. That's very much different than being a slave. I might argue that the Americans and the Europeans seem to be the slaves psychologically, because we see our culture, our way of life, our civilization disintegrating around our ears, and we're generally unwilling to do a damn thing. Whereas these Russian peasants, who hardly had anything, they had some pitchforks in some cases, they were willing to attack the Soviet Bolshevik regime, and they died for it, but at least they died on the right side of history. So Berezovsky, I think what's going on here is he's got an attitude of ethnic supremacy. It's obvious that Jews in post-Soviet Russia form an elite political and economic class. I mean, if they've got all the billions that used to belong to the state and the Russian people, then I think they're an elite prestige ethnicity by definition. I mean, it's just a fact, right? So that is motivating his statement, but it's not just about the Jewishness. It's also part of the worldwide political elite. This is how they think about us, whether they're Jews or not Jews, and regardless of whether we're Africans, Asians, Europeans, whatever we are, Americans, whatever we happen to be, this is how they think of us. And I think it's in large part because they don't share the history. They're from a completely different group of people. They don't come from peasants who ever had to defend their farm with a pitchfork or a gun or anything like that. And they just see us working, slowly building up our little houses and raising our families and all that, and we just look like cattle to them because mainly that's how they use us. What else to say here about this guy? He's dead. He died under mysterious circumstances, and it's probably, I'm glad he's dead, and I think all the oligarchs should be dead. I think they should all be killed. Of course, they should be put to trial first for treason against their various countries, and then they should be executed by the state. But if they turn up dead, I won't shed any tears. Putin was actually bankrolled by Berezovsky. That's why he was being interviewed in London. Berezovsky, so he and his friends, they ripped off all this money from the Russian people and the Russian state during the privatization, which was completely corrupt and completely illegitimate. But they basically, after Yeltsin was on the way out, they figured they were going to buy the next president. So they bankrolled Putin. They bought Putin, but they didn't get Putin. That's the funny part. He went rogue on them. He took their money and then turned around and started reconsolidating a new Russian state. He put a bunch of these guys in jail, and he chased a bunch of other ones out of the country. Now, he wasn't completely successful, and a whole lot of Russian capital was brought overseas and has never returned. And according to Matthew Raphael Johnson, that's the reason why all these guys aren't in jail or dead, is because there's still some hope that one day some of this capital will return home. This is my way of taking one specific case, which is Berezovsky making these statements about the Russian people, of whom it's obvious he doesn't even see himself as a part. He doesn't think of himself as a Russian. He thinks of himself as something else. And if you watch the rest of the interview around this part in the movie, it's called Poisoned by Polonium. But if you watch it, he's talking about liberalism. Liberalism and Western democracy is going to be what they need to bring to Russia. And it's quite obvious why. It would put people like him in complete control, which is basically the situation that we're in over here. So taking a look at these people, listening to what they have to say critically, and just comparing the basic record to history is really useful. And it's everywhere. I mean, nobody told me to watch this movie. I just looked it up and found it. And, I was extremely surprised to see this interview in there, and I thought this was the most interesting part of the movie because it basically confirms everything that we think about these people anyway. Okay, I'm rambling, so thank you for your time.